In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up logging for your data. Data logging allows you to store the history of property changes in your data model. This data can then be presented in something like a trend control so that it can be reviewed at a later point in time. So first, let's take a look at logging profiles. These are essential to the process of collecting and retaining your data. A logging profile allows you to refine how your data is collected. First, I'll click the Add Logging Configuration button. Then give this profile the name 10-second logging configuration. Next, I'll click OK to add this configuration to my model. The first property is pretty self-explanatory. The display name is what you've named your profile. You should give this a name that will allow you to easily know what the profile contains. The next property is the minimum time interval. This controls the minimum time period in which the data should be logged. For example, if we need to log our data every 10 seconds, we can set this value to 10, and then the server will attempt to log the value at that interval. After that, we have the maximum time interval. Used in conjunction with the minimum, the maximum time interval allows you to set a grace period for logging. For example, if we have our logging property set to 10 seconds, what happens if it changes at 12? With the help of the maximum interval, we could set this to something like 15 seconds to allow a 5-second grace period for our value change. That way, we'd still be able to capture the change within a reasonable time period. The next property is the deviation type. This controls how the value change should be interpreted. There's 3 options for this: absolute value, percent of range, and percent of value. As you can imagine, not every logging requirement will be the same type, and because of this, we tried to provide you with some reasonable options so that the data can be captured in a way that meets your needs. All 3 of these options behave as you expect. Absolute value is an absolute value, while percent of range is a percentage of the range set on a property being logged, and percent of value is a percentage of the value. Next, we have the deviation. This controls the amount that the value needs to change before it will be logged. This amount will be determined by what is set for the deviation type. For example, if you're using percent of the range and set the deviation to 1, then the value will need to change by an amount of 1% of the range or more before it will be logged. This concept will also apply to the other options for the deviation type as well, so you'll need to keep this in mind when setting this property. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using absolute value, so I'll set the deviation to 1. That way, anytime our value changes by at least 1, it will be logged. The last property is also self-explanatory. This is a description that allows you to briefly explain what the logging profile is for. I'll enter a description that says, "This profile logs the data every 10 seconds. Now that we have a clear understanding of how logging profiles work, we can enable historizing on our properties. To do this, you can go to your types and enable it on a property so that every new asset created will have that setting, or you can find an existing asset and enable it on the properties there. Before enabling historizing, it's a good idea to understand how logging can impact your system. At the heart of the enterprise system, the server writes data into your database. When you have lots of properties updating, these value changes are being written constantly into your database. If these properties aren't being logged, then the old value is just discarded and overwritten with a new one. If they are being logged, then the old one has to be saved in another location so that the new one can be added. This means that your database is constantly growing in size, possibly by a large amount depending on how many properties you've enabled logging on, as well as how often they're being logged. This isn't to dissuade you from using the logging feature. It's an extremely important tool for any process that needs to go back and examine data from the past. Rather, It's to inform you of the aspects that should be considered when creating your model. Data that has been logged can also be exported with the help of the database utility that's installed with Status Enterprise. As I mentioned, you can either enable historizing on your type so that new assets will have it enabled by default, or you can enable it on a single asset. For this demonstration, I'm just going to enable historizing on this existing asset. This can be done by simply checking the checkbox in the historizing field. Now that our property is logging the value changes, we need to make sure that it's only logging values at the interval we need them. That's where our logging profile comes into play. If I double-click the area in the logging config column, it will show us all of the logging configurations available for use. I can then select one and set it as the one I want to be used for this property. Logging profiles are optional, and you don't have to set them on your properties at all. Now, anytime this property changes, it will only be logged if the value change falls within what is set in the selected profile. It's important to note that when you're configuring logging on a new property, you need to allow some time for the data to be logged before it can be reviewed. At this point in time, I'm going to cut the video so I can give this some time to generate a history for us. Now that we've got some data, we can view it and see the history of value changes. Log data can either be viewed in our trending control or can be viewed in the model browser. For more information on trending, please see the video dedicated to configuring and using the trend control. In this demonstration, I'll be using the model browser to display data, so I'm going to go to the Start menu, then find the model browser and open it. Next, I'll enter my login information and click Connect and wait for it to load. Then I'll browse through my model and select the asset we have. Then I'll click on the History tab. Next, I'll double-click the PSI option and we'll open the history to view our data. Now we're able to see that the data has been logged in our history. You'll also notice that there's a history configuration bar at the bottom that can be expanded. This lets you configure things like how much data you want to see, the period you want to see it for, and can also interpolate your data for you. If I uncheck interpolation, then set the range selection to something like 1 minute and click Execute, you'll be able to see that our logging profile is only logging the data at the interval we set. There's also an option to export the data to a CSV file here as well. In closing, Status Enterprise is a powerful, easy-to-use tool that lets you design once and deploy multiple times. For more information about Status Enterprise and data logging, please visit us on the web at www.scada.com.